My name is Warren Walters. I'm a senior developer at a platinum consulting firm. So I started out in Salesforce as a lowly administrator slash developer intern, actually, and I worked my way along at a few different companies up to a developer. I originally, or my background starts out with computer science. So I went to university for information technology and I studied programming pretty intensively. And from there, I kind of fell into Salesforce from my internship and then continued to grow and work on it. So a lot of my responsibilities now that I'm a lead developer is working with my development team to grow the expertise and continue to bring up all of the developers that we have on our plate. And then also a lot of the projects that we deal with are very development heavy. So that means integrations, complex triggers, Lightning Web Components, and a lot of different aspects of Salesforce development, even moving into things like integrating Salesforce with React or pulling data from different areas in terms of like Heroku and Node.js. So there's a lot of outside of the normal development that we're doing. And it's really my job to kind of get the wealth of knowledge out from the team and spread it around and make sure that everybody's able to work on these projects as best as they can.
Perfect. That kind of paints a good picture in terms of that. What I was going to say is, in terms of when you said you started with admin slash developer, and then you kind of ended up as a developer, and which was an internship. I have heard this approach before in terms of people saying, how do I start within Salesforce? Well, you have a few options. One, you can be an accidental admin, which is a very extremely common approach. Secondly, is you just run these internships. You look for them and you start to put some experience on your CV. The one thing I want, or probably kind of two areas that I wanted to concentrate here is firstly, in terms of, you said, kind of managing your development team and trying to kind of at least spread the knowledge that exists within the team. So everyone has access to, in that probably part, I would want to kind of concentrate on the, I guess, what I would probably like stakeholder engagement within the company. And that means, with everyone that is a participant on a project. And secondly, I would want from a development point of view, in terms of how you protect your own kind of work and how you kind of keep safe on that. On the first point, I was going to say is how would you describe a standard project team? How would that be structured whenever you have one of these projects that you work on? Do you have a product manager? Do you have a project manager? What's kind of a starting point? Because I guess each one is different, but you should probably, you probably have a number of commonalities in between.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the project teams, they primarily consist of a project manager, a technical lead of some sort. So that could be an architect, an administrative lead, or even a development lead. And then you'll have the consultants underneath that project, which could be any sort of people like business analysts, developers, or admins. So in terms of the team structure, there's generally those three major categories. And if we want to talk more about the lead and consultant piece, because the project manager manages the project, they're not that hands-on. That's what the rest of the team is for. So when we talk about the technical lead on the project, you could have a developer or an admin in a very diverse skill set. But on development heavy projects, you may have somebody who's very experienced in on the development side of things. So let's say we're doing a really heavy integration and it's all code and barely any configuration type of deal. You'll have a technical lead that is a developer that kind of brings the team together to understand and break down all the different points of the project so that they could be passed out and user stories could be created, and so that you can actually understand the project. Because bringing in a technical lead that maybe isn't as familiar with development may cause some issues or maybe a little bit of back and forth between it. And then going deeper into that, let's say it's a 50-50 split on the project of, hey, we have some configuration work, some development work, you'll have like an architect on the team that will break down the project, work with the various consultants on the team to understand what needs to get done at what point, how long each thing is going to take, each task is going to take, and then create the user stories and start to actually do the work on the project.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. So from your point of view, as a developer lead, or as a lead in terms of that part, how is that presented to you, or what is kind of your take in terms of those requirements, and are you getting involved throughout the way? I guess it kind of depends on your role on that particular project as well. But as developers, would you get involved along the way, or are you just presented those user stories when they're quote unquote kind of finished and ready to be developed? How is that? What is that approach?
Yeah, so in a perfect world, we would be involved right at the beginning. We're able to help in the initial scoping of the project, so maybe even do pre-sales on it. And then once we have the actual project, we are there to help break down the user stories and get the information that we need from the actual client itself. So that may mean we're sitting there and doing client meetings and talking to the client to understand their requirements. In other instances, you may just get the user stories without ever even knowing what's in the SOW or what's going on in the project. You just get slapped something. Here's your integration. You need to talk to this and this. And it's like, well, we've never seen this before, but here we go anyways. We're going to try to get it done. So yeah. I think it varies a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, because in a way that's a good thing and that's a bad thing. The bad thing is like, yes, you would say, well, I would really prefer to be involved from the beginning, but I would probably say from like I don't know, like a business, have the kind of the business cap on, is you wouldn't really want to waste a developer's time on pre-sales. And secondly, if you have the resource that will actually know and understand the technicalities and just be able to present a correctly structured user story to a developer, then technically you have the resource that you need in there, so you don't really need the developer in there. So that's why I'm thinking probably good thing, bad thing, the fact that you were kind of sometimes presented in that way. The other thing I was going to ask is, how do you deal with potentially miscommunication? Because that's probably kind of at the core of any conflict. So I wouldn't want to say, how do you deal with conflict? It's like conflict is probably kind of the, the conclusion of the basic miscommunication or misunderstanding and all of that. And how do you deal with that to keep everyone in the loop from your point of view in terms of, what you're developing? Do you keep your product manager or whoever passes, or the architect, in the loop with your development slate? Do you guys use any tools for that? What is your approach?
Yeah, communication is key in all of this. And you as a consultant, you definitely know this, but for anybody just starting out, communication is key to any project success, in my opinion. So if you are questioning, or if you don't know about something, don't just hold it in. Get in front of any problem that you have and raise a red flag instantly, because it is better to get in front of an issue early before it becomes a problem. So I'll just leave that out there as the first thing that you should do, and I try to follow in a lot of my projects, is just over communicate, because that will start to reduce headaches. So when we look at the overall issue of like dealing with conflict, and it's kind of like reducing scope creep in a sense, it's really about getting in front of the client in terms of the project and making sure that what you're building is actually what they want. So this means in classic agile fashion, doing demos every week or every so often in your sprint, and just getting in front of the client and making sure that they are testing. Internally, when it comes to like project managers and project architects, if you're just working on a specific piece of code, it means working with your project team to make sure that what you're building is actually what the client is expecting or what everybody else is expecting. So once again, that goes back to communication. Maybe after you're done with the section, you say, hey, I'm done with this specific piece. Come over here and look at it, check it out. And that's a big thing that I try to push towards my team, is just to make sure as many eyes that can be on your specific section are on there, because you don't want to end up at the end of a project or halfway through the project going to the client or going to the project manager and saying, okay, here's what I built, and they say this is completely wrong. We need to do it all over again. That's the worst feeling.
That's the worst feeling. And yeah, I mean, that's, again, from like a business point of view, that's, potentially, you need to kind of quote unquote kind of take a hit in order to sustain the relationship with the client. Mm-hmm. And then, yeah. The one thing you mentioned there is the idea of scope creep and presumably or potentially a lot of the conflicts, especially when it comes to the client, is either not delivering what the client is looking for, or potentially the client having a few assumptions in their back pocket that they're hoping that they will be kind of slided in throughout these types of conversations. So going to that, what is your experience when it comes to scope creep? Have you had it? And secondly, what's your kind of approach to potentially deal with that? And what's probably the most common way of getting that? Because there are probably a few commonalities in terms of how that kind of shows itself towards the end of the project.
Yeah. Scope creep. Have I dealt with scope creep? Of course, 100%. I would say if a consultant has not dealt with scope creep, I want to know who their pre-sales team is, and I want to take them, because they must be amazing. I think with the idea of how to like combat this, or where it kind of comes from in my mind, it will originally start with the pre-sales conversation, or the SOW type of, before you even get to hands to keyboard and start typing or doing anything like that. It's about setting the correct foundation for the client, so that what they have in their head is actually taken out and put either on paper or some sort of print, so that this is exactly what they want, and it's not just floating around and they're making assumptions on it. So I think that's the first piece, is just having the correct conversations with the client to bring out whatever's in their mind into life, so that we can actually understand it. And you're not going to get it right 100% of the time. Everybody's idea of how a screen or a page or a process should work may be a little bit different in their head, but at the end of the day, you have to try to extract as much information out of them, so that when you start building this, it actually makes sense and is what they're expecting. So that's probably the first piece. The second piece is kind of what I've said before, with being able to do like iterative processes and iterative demos with whoever you're working with, so that what they're expecting is what you're actually building. So there's a lot of times where we'll demo something with a client and it's moving in the right direction, and maybe 2 weeks later they're saying, oh, well, we don't want this page over here anymore. We want it flipped around and turned upside down and moved over here. And for us, it really depends on how big that flip is. If it's as easy as like checking a checkbox, we'll move it over. But if it's moving mountains, then we're going to have a conversation about, hey, this is what we expected versus here's what we expected and what we said we were going to do versus what you are now asking us to do. And that boils down to the pre-sales piece of things and getting it on paper. So that's like the statement of work, the SOW, and also the BRD, the business requirements document, which is kind of the more detailed version of everything that we are going to build. It's really about making sure that everybody understands what everyone is expecting. So from the client side, they want X, Y, and Z. From our side, we're saying we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And if you do let's say an SOW well or BRD well, you'll have like an exclusions or out of scope items that says we will not do C under any circumstances unless you pay us. So I think that really helps in terms of reducing scope creep and having things in concrete. A lot of times you may not have that type of documentation and information written in stone, but it's a lot easier to say, hey, you guys signed off on this BRD. It says that we're not going to do C, we're not going to do this Lightning Web Component unless you give us the extra hours or you pay us the extra $1,000 to get it done. We are not doing that. And it's really easy, it's the power of paper and a signature. It's really easy to say that versus you not having anything And then it's, well, oh, I thought we were going to include that. It made sense to make this workflow or make it automated. I have to type this in manually type of deal. So it's really good to have it written down, the best you can.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, if I've had a bit of experience when it comes to that, and I think there are a few things. You mentioned like a second piece of document, which is like a more detailed version of the statement of work, and in my mind, it's like, well, okay, well that in itself needs writing and all that, but actually, it will save you more until the end of the project than not investing that time at the beginning.
Yeah, I think with consulting, like, everything's about our time, right? We're selling our time, we're selling our mind and our expertise, but ultimately it's like we said we're going to do something in X amount of hours. Here's what we're expecting to do. We think we can do it at this time. Here's a document that says we can do what you think for a specific amount of time. From there, if there's fluctuations or assumptions in there, you can kind of add them in and take them out depending on how the project is going, but you don't want to go over that. It's better to have your time solidified and documented out versus just kind of willy-nilly flip-flopping between a lot of the different avenues that you're going down and making assumptions as you go out throughout the project. It can really lead to some friction between you and the client.
Yeah, that makes total sense. The last point I was going to cover here, and I've had a few discussions with other architects, consultants, etc. And the one commonality that I have found there is, for example, in case you're thinking of starting within Salesforce potentially, or the objective should be potentially to kind of concentrate on one particular segment. So if you're a Sales Cloud person, if you're Service Cloud, communities, etc. Because as a consultant, you become a specialist in an area. Of course, you can diversify and you can, follow different paths within the industry, but potentially just like honing in that. When it comes to development, it's, in my mind, it's a different ball game, if it makes sense. Because if you are receiving correct user stories, detailed user stories, process maps, etc., in a way, you don't really care if you're building for a trigger or an Apex class or a Lightning component, bringing data for your opportunities, or bringing data for your cases, or bringing data for whatever. So my question for you would be, what's your take around that? Are there specialities, if it makes sense, within development? Probably I'm thinking, things like Commerce Cloud or Marketing Cloud. Potentially there may be a bit of speciality there. But when it comes to the core platform, are there segments within that, or you don't think there are?
I think there are specialties and things that people can become experts in the core platform. Let's just take, for example, I'll say core development, right? So that may be Apex, triggers, and a lot of the general, I'm doing air quotes, like back-end Salesforce development. But then you have specialties like Lightning Web Components and Visualforce Pages, or Commerce Cloud, which is completely separate. B2B commerce, and there's even specialties based on the different clouds that are currently out there. So there's some funky stuff around like Field Service Lightning and just working with the Field Service Lightning objects and the queries that you can call. Same thing with Community Cloud, because if you want to do interactions with the community page builder or build like a specific header, you're going to need some background knowledge to kind of understand that. I'm not saying that a normal or somebody who isn't experienced in B2B as a developer will not be able to do anything or complete a B2B user story or code in it. It's just going to take them longer. It goes back to the time and experience with things. If you've never written FSL code before, it may be a little bit confusing and there's new limits and constraints put on you because of the FSL objects. Versus if you've already have experience with that, you already know, hey, this is something that I'm going to run into. I'll have to write my code or my trigger in this specific way to get around it automatically, versus writing all of your code, hitting the roadblock, researching how to get around it, and then redoing your code. So it boils down to experience and going back to a lot of the information we talked about earlier, which is just, if you can predict some of the issues that you're going to have in like pre-sales or beforehand, you can kind of build your scopes a little bit better and build your user stories a little bit better, so that you're able to not spend extra time learning on the job, where you already have the experience to take care of the stuff. And when we talk about like Lightning Web Components and user interface types of things, that's like a whole different ballgame, because you have like Lightning Web Components and Aura, and inside of that, you'll have the specialities of like UX, UI, so interface design, and then the interesting pieces of Lightning Web Components that go around like, should we use a wire adapter versus just calling an Apex imperative method or not? So there's definitely some specialities. I think it's good to be well-rounded in a lot of the sense, so knowing a lot of the things, but maybe not specialize 100% on one specific thing, unless it's like really big. And of course, I missed the biggest one. You could be like an integration specialist. Like integrations as a whole is its own like subdomain inside of Salesforce programming, because integrations happen all the time. And almost every one of my projects that I deal with, there's some sort of integration that I'm writing. And I would say if there's one thing to specialize in, it may be just integrations and understanding the core architecture and how to write really well defined and well written integrations, both ways throughout the platform.
Yeah, that does make sense. I mean, even like I said, even with consultants, the idea is like, if Sales Cloud, it doesn't mean that you can't implement Service Cloud, but it'll probably take you a bit longer. You'll probably need to research a few things and get through that. Last piece on this is probably again linked with developers, but we're kind of moving towards the career part in terms of there's no kind of secret around the fact that Salesforce skills are in need, and of course Salesforce are trying to push this with Trailhead and a lot of community members pushing out tutorials and videos around that, and that is shared, etc. What I was going to ask around that is, would someone make a decision to become a Salesforce developer, or would they make a decision to become a developer and then from there potentially you'll kind of spread? Or what would be your recommendation in case you were to advise someone going into college, or someone just thinking about career change, or they're at the point in time, should people just jump straight into Apex and try to figure out triggers, figure out Apex, and so on? And so probably that's kind of the I guess in my mind somehow the easiest way to kind of to start with, if we take the declarative stuff out of the way. Or would you advise just start the correct path of try to learn HTML, CSS, and so on and so forth?
Right. For new grads, I will always recommend studying computer science in some way, shape, or form, whether that's MIS or computer science, IT, whatever floats your boat. I will always recommend some sort of computer science background. Computers are the way of the future in my mind, and I've been successful going down the path of programming and that type of stuff. For career change, I would. You may get differences of opinions on this, but I recommend going down the traditional development path first before trying to go down and just learn Apex, straight out the gate. Not saying that you can't just learn Apex and be successful, but there are a lot of intricate pieces to development and programming in general that you will, I won't say you won't learn it, but it may not be presented that heavily while you're learning Salesforce specific development. If you learn Java development as a whole, you'll understand classes and patterns along with the normal things like if statements, for loops, and how code works itself. But there's a deeper computer science aspect to programming that I try to instill into people as they start to learn it, like time complexity. You kind of get a glimpse of what time complexity is with Salesforce development, with the limits that they impose on you. You may wonder, your code is only allowed to run for 5 seconds in Salesforce, no longer than 5 seconds. And people who maybe don't study like data structures and computer science may not understand fully why that's there. And it's around the multi-tenant architecture that Salesforce has, but it's really so that your code doesn't lock up the system. That's plain and simple. But there's a piece behind that around like what your code is actually doing and how long it takes to execute fully that normal Salesforce development and teaching will, as far as I've seen, will not teach you. So there's that aspect of it. I think that traditional development will kind of teach you data structures and time complexities and a lot of the more detailed computer science topics that may not be covered inside of Salesforce. But if you're kind of like mid-career shift, you're not a new grad or anything like that, I would recommend going the admin to developer route. So you're growing your administrative skills, you're continuing to learn Salesforce and what Salesforce actually is. It's hard to just grasp what Salesforce is until you're in it. So I think having an admin role will really help you understand what Salesforce is, what it does, what it can do, and then work your way into a developer, like a full-time or a junior developer position. From there, you can hopefully learn and build on top of the knowledge you had as an admin to become a full-fledged developer and learn some of the background items of development that you may not have been taught and you just kind of picked up as you learned Salesforce development.
Perfect. Well, what I was going to say is thank you for your time. And in case you want to, share some of your profiles, do you do LinkedIn? Do you do YouTube, Twitter? What's your social social network of choice there?
Sure. I think LinkedIn is the biggest one. So you can find me at linkedin.com/Walters954. And then on YouTube as well, you can find me at /Walters954. I guess youtube.com/Walters954. So check me out there. I do YouTube tutorials and willing to help out anybody on some topics that they may have, consulting, mentoring, development, you name it. I'll help you out the best I can.